No. Just no. China is not about to collapse. Very recently, there have been a slew of videos on YouTube that have been making the rounds and being shared around saying that China's about to collapse in 34 days, or the CCP will collapse in X amount of days. China's economy is going to collapse in 25 days, 22 days. I don't even know how many days. I have no idea where they're getting these ridiculous day figures from. But I must assure you all that this is not true. I'm not here to poo-poo those other YouTubers, by the way. A lot of what they say in their videos is correct. However, a lot of them have got it wrong. And I'm going to explain to you, especially since a lot of these other videos have actually used footage and information, I'm guessing, from my own videos. So there's one video in particular that was being shared to me a lot because a lot of people recognized my footage inside of this video, a lot of the footage I took in ghost towns and that sort of thing. And I went to take a look at it, I watched it, and I did leave a comment saying, I'm very happy for people to use my footage. I'm that kind of person, I don't care. If you want to use footage from my YouTube channel, go ahead. But it's nice to give me a little shout out or, maybe a little credit in the description down there somewhere would be nice. Seems like they shadow banned my comment so nobody could read it, and that's pretty unprofessional in the YouTube circles anyway. The fact of the matter is that you cannot put a date on the so-called collapse of the CCP or the Chinese economy. I'm not saying that the Chinese economy isn't going to collapse to a certain degree, because it has already, and it's continuing to spiral down in many different sectors. The thing is, it's the absolute control that the CCP has over the media and the populace that will prevent a big Lehman Brothers style collapse, financial crisis 2008 that we saw here in America and that we saw in places like Japan in the late 80s, early 90s. One cannot underestimate just how much control the Chinese government has over what happens in China, what people know about in China, and what is allowed to happen in China. You see, a lot of these other YouTubers and financial experts and so on are basing their ideas and their information off of the fact that in most democratic countries around the world, most developed countries, even developing countries, if they were to face what China is facing right now, as far as a massive property bubble with the ghost cities, this big Ponzi scheme, with the banks now withholding people's money, making excuses to freeze accounts, things like that. In most countries, yes, you would see a massive economic collapse. But China is not most countries, because most countries, especially democratic countries, have a little something called freedom of press, freedom of speech. When something bad goes down, people can hear about it. People have the right to protest if their bank suddenly decides to steal all their money, for instance. In China, no. When something bad happens in a particular sector, people are affected, yes. People lose their life savings, yes. People are plunged into poverty, yes. But when they try to do something about it or make a noise about it, they are silenced. They're either detained, arrested, all discussion of these things are censored online. And at the end of the day, all that you end up with is a whole lot of people who have had their lives ruined, but then they're silenced and pushed aside. And it goes out of the social consciousness. People don't really continue to think about it. Think about the Evergrande collapse. That was big news around the world when it happened. It is big news. Something like that should have shook the entire industry, which it did. It absolutely did in China. It absolutely did have massive ramifications throughout the real estate market and so on and so forth, but it really did not make a huge impact on the people in China. It didn't have the cooling off effect that you would expect in mainland China. People still went out and bought houses. People are still buying houses now in China, even though a massive collapse of one of the biggest real estate companies in China, if that had happened anywhere else in the world, it would have had a massive cooling off effect. People would not be confident in the real estate market. People would not be buying houses. But because in China they were able to quash the protests, because there were people that lost huge amounts of money who'd invested in Evergrande, they quashed the protests, they pushed it aside, and once again filled the local news cycle with different things, Taiwan, for instance, and whatever else is going on in order to distract people. People have kind of forgotten about it, and it's been compartmentalized and pushed aside. So yes, the other YouTubers and financial experts that use a Western lens to point at China and say, look, the economy is going to collapse. Well, that's the problem. They are using a Western lens. There's this other fallacy going on out there, that the CCP is going to collapse and that the CCP's end is near. And I have to tell you that this is not true. The CCP will not collapse. As much as it pains me to say so, the CCP will not collapse and cannot collapse. And I'll explain to you why. It's not that the Chinese people don't want to rise up against the CCP when their freedoms are trampled on and when terrible things happen to them. It's that they can't. The last time there was an attempt to stand up to the CCP was still when China was in this big process of dramatic change in the late 80s. You know, China had opened up to capitalism and was experimenting with that. There was a lot of change, and the young people decided to stand up, and we all know what happened in 1989 at Tiananmen Square. Countless young people and students were murdered by the government. That's the last time anyone was able to stand up. And prior to that, even more big atrocities happened under the governance of this exact same government. So for people to think that for some reason the Chinese people are going to stand up now against the government and revolt or try to force some kind of regime change, it just means that they don't understand China. Let me put it to you this way. Imagine the government has forced you and your family to be part of a commune that has to produce a certain amount of grain. And they send you out into the countryside, and you have to go and do this. But because of their bad management and all the corruption and all this top-down leadership nonsense and these ridiculous policies of, well, instead of farming, we have to now produce steel, or let's kill all the sparrows, or whatever the case, everyone starts to starve. And the government has access to excess grain. They've got stores of grain that's there, just in case there is some kind of a food shortage or some kind of an emergency. They have access to that, but they refuse to give it to you. They have complete control over the food and who's allowed to eat what. And you start to see your family members die of starvation one by one. First your grandparents, some of your uncles, your aunts, your parents, your mother, your father dying in front of your eyes of starvation. And you still don't rise up against the government? Well, that's what happened in China. People started cannibalizing each other. People still praise the man, Mao Zedong, who stood over all of this and allowed it to happen. The person who willfully allowed people to starve, knowing very well that people were starving, knowing very well that he had access to all of this excess grain that he could have released to the public in order to save their lives. So you have to think about it in that context. Why would people in modern China now, who are not in as bad a position as the people were during the Great Leap Backwards and the cultural devolution, the bad old days of Mao Zedong, they're not in that bad a position yet. They're not starving to death. They don't have the military there shooting them for stealing a handful of rice or something like that. They don't have this terrible, terrible oppression that they suffered very recently in history. And I'm talking very recently, in the late 60s. I'm talking about while America was landing a man on the moon. This kind of crap was going on in China. So many people still alive that went through that. Now, that was terrible, and they endured that. They endured that, and they didn't revolt. They endured starving to death. They endured having all of their property taken away, their freedoms taken away. They endured it. So why would they not endure a situation where all of their life savings are taken away, where their property is taken away, where the economy just slows down to an almost a halt? Well, of course they're going to endure it. They don't have a choice. Anyone who stands up will be dealt with by the PLA, as we've seen in the past. They've demonstrated this all throughout the history that the Communist Party of China has been in power. And don't forget, the exact same government that is in power right now in China is the exact same government that ordered the tanks in to Tiananmen Square. The exact same government that allowed tens of millions of Chinese people to starve to death when they could have saved them. The exact same government that forced families to have only one child and forced abortions and other terrible atrocities on anyone who decided against that. And the exact same government that saw countless people plunged into poverty because of very, very bad and poorly executed government programs during the so-called Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward. China has, for the longest time, suffered tyrants. And the Chinese people are some of the hardest, are some of the most enduring people I've ever met. They can endure hardships that you wouldn't believe. So they will continue to endure suffering and not rise up. They will endure starvation. They will endure their money being taken. They will endure their property being taken. And they will endure slavery under the CCP, as they have in the past, without rising up. Because rising up means only one thing in modern China, and that is defeat. So for those of you who keep predicting that China's Communist Party is going to be overthrown or going to collapse or the economy is going to collapse, there's a lot of truth in what you say. The economy is, like I said, already on a downturn. The economy is going to collapse to a certain degree, but it's not going to change the status quo. Remember, in very recent history, Chinese people have been through a lot worse. Children ratting out their parents, having their parents taken away to be executed or exiled or whatever the case may be, locked up because they say that their parents said something against the government. Tens of millions of people starving to death, eating every single moving thing in China, eating the bark off of the trees, all of the nature in China being destroyed to burn these ridiculous homemade smelters to try and create steel. All sorts of ridiculous things have happened in recent history in China. So losing your life savings is nothing close to what the Chinese people have endured in recent history. Remember this, as much as China spends on its military, it spends far more on domestic security. In other words, controlling the local populace in China. So we see these military parades and all these fancy weapons and these marches and so on, and you think, wow, China really is a strong country. But imagine that the amount of money spent on that is doubled, tripled, even more in order to combat local uprisings, in order to keep the population down. So, again, all these videos you're seeing coming out saying China's economy will collapse in 23 days. It's bullshit. It's not going to collapse. The people are not going to revolt. And the CCP will not collapse or dissolve or be taken over because they have too much power. They absolutely have power over every aspect of everybody's lives in China. I'm not just talking about the media and the brainwashing and so on. They have control over your finances. They have control over your family. They have control over your movements. They can stop you from buying a plane ticket, a bus ticket, a train ticket. They can stop you from going to school. They can stop you from renting a house. They can stop you from anything. And there's nothing you can do about it because it's a massive machine. The military is huge. The local security organs are huge. You have no idea how difficult it is in China to go against the grain. It's impossible. And that's why it's left up to people like myself to do so on behalf of the people who cannot. I've recently been contacted by a Chinese person who reached out to me many years ago. I actually interviewed him on my channel. He was completely blurred out and there was no mention of his name. Somebody who got into a lot of trouble and was arrested for making a joke about Xi Jinping. And there's some very good news on his behalf. He's managed to escape. He's now in a place where he's safe. And there's some very good news I can't wait to share with you all. And he wants me to keep it quiet for now because he doesn't, as he said, want to pop the champagne on the plane to his destination because he needs to arrive there first. So we'll get into that in the future. The reason I'm mentioning this is that there are so many people in China who yearn for freedom and who yearn for changes in the government. Not everybody's sitting there all satisfied with the way things are going. All of the people that are upset and in a terrible situation because their life savings have been stolen by these unscrupulous banks, and the banks are now freezing their accounts and doing all sorts of strange things. Not just the Henan banks, but big banks too, as we spoke about in our China show, which, by the way, if you haven't seen last week's China show, please go and take a look at it. It's very important. In fact, every week we bring the latest news out of China. We give you a real perspective based on experience as to what's going on. It is awful what is going on in China. And what a lot of these YouTubers that are out there predicting the collapse and talking about the economy collapsing, a lot of what they're saying is true. The banking crisis is true. The debt bubble is massive. The housing problem, with the whole ghost city thing with the ridiculous real estate Ponzi scheme. A lot of these things are absolutely true. I've covered these topics on my channel recently. The thing I have a problem with is this ridiculous idea of putting a timestamp on it and saying China is going to collapse in X amount of days, or the economy is going to collapse in X amount of days. Because one thing that all of these other YouTubers do not understand, and that is that China is unlike the West. China is unlike most countries who have some sort of open and free communication, some kind of accountability of the government and of different departments. China is different in that aspect. Having lived there for 14 years, I've seen it with my own eyes, the staggering amount of lies and bullshit that the government puts out. It's all a facade, it's all about face, and it has complete control over everything. And the economy, even if big portions of it collapse, not only would you probably not know about it, but the local people in China certainly would not know. Those who are not affected by it directly absolutely would not know about it. Listen, in all honesty, things are looking very grim in China. And yes, there is economic downturn. And yes, there will be a lot of decoupling. And yes, there will be a lot of pain. And yes, it will have a knock-on effect to the rest of the world. And especially all you clueless people out there that invest your 401ks in Asia emerging markets and prop up this ridiculous economy in China. You're probably going to see losses too. This is just going to be a part of this. But you know what? The CCP is not going anywhere. So I just wanted to get that out there, get it off my chest. And hopefully you won't be misled by sensationalist videos and people who don't really understand China. As always, you know the drill. Stay awesome.